Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the phenomenon of virtue signaling, which is basically about how we publicly display our supposed moral correctness and rectitude in order to look good to other people, and ultimately to ourselves. And as usual, here's a roadmap of the material in this video, which you can also find in the description section, along with links to the timestamps. Anyhow, so the topic du jour is virtue signaling. And probably the first obvious question is, why do we do it? Basically, what are our motivations for virtue signaling? And as we noted, probably the first and most obvious answer would be, well, to look good to other people, especially by laying claim to some sort of moral or quasi-moral superiority. But then the question becomes, to look good to whom? And here the fairly obvious answer is, to people we want to impress. Well, but who would that be? Well, people we want to be around. And who is that? Well, people with whom we identify, or at least with whom we want to identify. In other words, virtue signaling is ultimately about our group identities and affiliations. Of course, that's not how people who habitually virtue signal would want us to perceive it. What we're supposed to perceive is the obvious universal correctness of their moral standards and demands. In other words, virtue signaling seems to be about the issue of moral conduct, but in reality, it's mostly about establishing and perpetuating group identities of one sort or another. For instance, people on the political left don't virtue signal primarily to convince people on the right of the validity of their moral imperatives. Their virtue signaling is almost exclusively aimed at other leftists, and its purpose is to bolster their group identity and status. And people on the right do the exact same thing with respect to their own group identity. But of course, the reason why group identity is so important to us in the first place is that we're really looking for a way of feeling good about ourselves, especially by having some sense that what we're doing with our lives is substantive and meaningful. And if we have no other way of attaining that, well, we can always just align ourselves with one group or another and with its corresponding moral ordering of the world. But how exactly does virtue signaling work? How do we actually go about proclaiming our allegiance to the morality of a particular group? Well, in the adult world, it hardly ever works just to blather on at length about our supposedly superior values. Hardly anyone is going to listen to that, first because it's boring as hell, but more importantly because pretty much everyone knows that true moral exemplars don't need to do that sort of thing in the first place. So basically, virtue signaling in the adult world requires a much more indirect and surreptitious strategy than that. And I'd say that for the most part it takes two forms, and they usually operate in tandem. One of those forms has to do with publicly displaying our moral indignation and outrage, and the other has to do with insulting and degrading our supposed opponents so that we can implicitly claim some sort of moral superiority over them. And like I said, those two forms are very frequently combined. But for the sake of clarity, let's look at them one at a time. Let's begin by looking at people's public displays of moral indignation and outrage. Of course, sometimes all of that can be a matter of genuine conviction. But on the other hand, I'd say that a lot of the time what seems to be real convictions on the surface are just disguises and excuses for underlying motives that are actually far less noble and far more self-serving than that. But of course, that doesn't make virtue signaling different in principle from many other kinds of human activity. In any case, I'd say that our public displays of moral indignation and outrage sometimes take more individual forms and sometimes more collective, crowd-oriented forms. In the individual sphere, one of the more conspicuous types of virtue signaling occurs among celebrities and politicians, if we can still regard those as two distinct categories. That's probably not too surprising, first because there's always an element of theatricality in virtue signaling, which we'll discuss a little bit later in this video, but more importantly because celebrity and politics so often involve actively seeking out popularity, which in turn has a lot to do with trying to look good to other people. So, all things considered, virtue signaling among celebrities and politicians is a fairly predictable and understandable phenomenon. It's basically about playing the same popularity game those groups are always playing anyhow. But of course, most of us aren't celebrities or politicians, at least not in the strict sense. So thank God we have social media, where we can publicly display our supposed virtues anyhow. And in fact, it seems to me that a pretty large fraction of our activity on social media is basically about that. But of course, on a much more modest scale than the grandiose virtue signaling of celebrities and politicians. However, in contrast to virtue signaling in its more individual forms, collective virtue signaling would include things like public demonstrations, marches, public activism of various sorts, etc. Of course, there's undoubtedly a certain degree of variability in our motivations for engaging in those kinds of activities. However, it seems fairly obvious, at least to me, that at a psychological level, virtue signaling is a pretty big motivation. And within the domain of collective virtue signaling, it also seems apparent that a lot of it is governed by the sorts of dynamics that sociologists and social psychologists typically study, which would include phenomena like groupthink, de-individuation, and the diffusion of responsibility, among others. Which, of course, would go a long way toward explaining why virtue signaling can take some pretty extreme and ridiculous forms when people who share a group identity start banding together in crowds. However, as I mentioned earlier, the other related form of virtue signaling isn't so much about publicly proclaiming the superiority of our own moral values, but about putting down people who don't necessarily or immediately agree with them. Basically, people we want to regard as adversaries or enemies somehow. I'm going to call that type of virtue signaling derogatory virtue signaling, and I'd say that a lot of it operates according to the logic of that great time-honored mainstay of the kindergarten playground, name-calling. Or, as we like to say in the more rarefied atmosphere of higher education, the ad hominem fallacy. Of course, one obvious place to notice derogatory virtue signaling is in the political sphere and in people's everyday conversations about it, where these days it seems like we're all ceaselessly trying to lay claim to some sort of quasi-moral superiority by insulting our perceived opponents. For instance, that's why so many of us on the political right are eager to label our supposed enemies as snowflakes and cucks, which is really just an indirect way of virtue signaling that I myself am the opposite of snowflakes and cucks. Damn it! And on the other side of the political divide, it's why so many of us on the left are quick to invoke the hyperbolic language of fascism, Nazism, racism, and misogyny, which is an indirect way of signaling that I myself am the exact opposite of fascists, racists, misogynists, homophobes, etc. But no matter where it occurs on the political spectrum, derogatory virtue signaling is basically about implicitly puffing ourselves up by putting other people down. And when you think about it, doesn't a fairly large fraction of what passes for political discourse and commentary these days basically boil down to that? But the main point is that derogatory virtue signaling requires an enemy, someone we can insult and degrade so that we can then implicitly lay claim to moral superiority over them. Of course, the raging contradiction is that going around insulting and degrading other people isn't exactly a convincing indicator of our own moral superiority. In fact, it's pretty much the exact opposite, which is why it's incredibly important to disguise that contradiction when we're virtue signaling. And the main way we do that is to convince ourselves, and our audience too, that the positions we're espousing are just obviously better, and that the world needs to take them really, really seriously, damn it! But personally, I find that's just a flimsy charade, a kind of ridiculous pantomime, mostly because the larger reality is that no one has a definitive lock on the ultimate moral good of life. Not me, not you, and certainly not any self-appointed virtue signaling expert braying through a bullhorn about it. Instead, derogatory virtue signaling, the type that's always looking for an enemy to be insulted and degraded and disempowered, is usually motivated by something much more primitive and much more personal. Namely, our underlying desire to feel the strange, consuming eroticism of moral indignation and self-righteousness, whose seductive power lies in the fiction of our own self-importance and in our own barely repressed lust for dominance over others. And that's why there's always a strong undercurrent of judgmentalism in derogatory virtue signaling. That's because the act of insulting and degrading our supposed enemies naturally places us in the position of being their moral arbiter. Basically, their judge, jury, and executioner. That's seductive, first because it's a way of satiating our lust for dominance and superiority over our opponents. But more importantly, the element of judgmentalism deflects our attention away from having to confront our own flaws and failings, which automatically absents us from assuming responsibility for improving ourselves and our own lot in life. That's because derogatory virtue signaling focuses our attention on judging other people's failings, or perhaps toward bemoaning more systemic flaws in our world's overall structure. And that basic shift in attention away from the uncomfortable task of confronting our own faults, which over time easily coalesces into a habitual lack of self-awareness, is why hardened virtue signalers often end up falling into the trap of behaving exactly like their supposed enemies. For instance, why Antifa activists end up looking and sounding and behaving much more like actual fascists than their opponents do most of the time. It's because when we become thoroughly intoxicated by our self-righteousness and the supposed superiority of our own moral and ideological agendas, it's incredibly easy to forget that wise, cautionary maxim from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. If you want to battle monsters, be careful not to become one yourself. But like I said earlier, there's also a theatrical element to virtue signaling. In other words, virtue signaling is basically about a kind of dramatic performance, a way of generating a show for an audience where we wear masks that look far more lofty and noble and morally elevated than how we actually are in real life, which once again becomes convincing only insofar as we meticulously avoid glimpsing our own real-life blemishes and ugliness. In that regard, virtue signaling is really little more than another form of what's sometimes known as spiritual bypassing, which involves our attempts to promote ourselves to the uppermost echelons of spiritual development without being willing to walk the long road to get there, without doing much of the actual hard work and self-exploration it really takes. To put it bluntly, the virtue of virtue signaling is hardly ever authentic or real. It's mostly scripted according to the conventions and values of whatever group identity we're trying to emulate. It's a kind of virtual virtue, if you will. And its prospective audience can consist of many different people in our lives. But always at the center of the whole production, sitting in rapt attention in the most lavish box seat in the house, is ourselves. And our desperate hope is that when the curtain finally closes, we'll be able to rise to our feet in a great feverish thunderstorm of applause. But in all likelihood, the hard reality is that we'll be the only ones clapping, our solitary ovation reverberating sadly against the dreary walls of the empty virtue signaling theater we've constructed for ourselves. Because at the end of the day, no one really cares about our pathetic efforts to prove our supposed moral superiority. Perhaps not even ourselves, if we're really honest about it. No one really cares about all of our sound and fury, all of our righteous indignation and outrage and venomous denunciation of our purported enemies. That's because at the end of the day, everyone pretty much knows that any real virtue, the kind that's genuinely worth honoring and venerating in others, isn't about what we claim, but about how we are. And it needs no signaling because it's already self-evident to anyone who's willing to feel its presence. Okay, so let's move toward ending this video by taking up one more topic. The whole business of naming or calling out virtue signaling when we notice it. Well, in that vein, it's probably a good idea to mention a fairly obvious paradox, which is that calling out people's virtue signaling can easily become just another form of virtue signaling. Just another somewhat trickier way of regarding ourselves as superior by engaging in the self-serving theater of quasi-moral judgmentalism. So, all things considered, calling out virtue signaling, which, by the way, I might myself be guilty of somewhat in this video, isn't actually a very good response to it. True, doing that may help our world learn not to take people's childish moralizing pretensions quite so seriously, which I would say is definitely worthwhile. But the problem is that shaming people who are mired in virtue signaling doesn't do much to help them grow out of it. The reason is that when we're being shamed, it hardly ever helps us grow beyond our problems and pathologies and develop as human beings. Instead, what shaming usually does is irritate us, which then causes us to be even more defiantly entrenched in our unwholesome habits than we ever were before. So then the question is, well, what would a good response to virtue signaling be? Well, in my view, a far better response would be to treat people who do it with compassion. But then the next natural question would probably be, well, okay, but how can we feel genuine compassion for people when they're being so peevish and so full of themselves? Well, perhaps one path toward that would be to make an effort to see things from their perspective as well as we can, to allow ourselves to perceive, and perhaps more importantly, to feel the many layers of insecurity and self-doubt and basic human suffering that necessitate the whole theatrical production of virtue signaling in the first place. To begin to see virtue signaling as a kind of developmental phase, a very human rite of passage that many of us have to pass through. A little like a kind of spiritual adolescence, perhaps. And sure, adolescence is full of all kinds of strange, ungainly histrionisms a lot of the time. But at the same time, it's the locus of untold potential, incredible changes, and sudden bursts of unexpected realization, and ultimately, movement toward the heart and center of human existence. And speaking of that phase of life, maybe it's not such a bad idea to remember our own adolescence, spiritual or otherwise, and to feel a sense of kinship with virtue signalers who, yeah, can be pretty annoying and self-absorbed at one level, but who are just trying to find their faltering way along the road of life. After all, in the final analysis, we're all just travelers in this world, each of us trying to make the best of it as we go. And we're all carrying baggage in one way or another. And we're all bearing wounds and scars, reminders of where we've been and how we've struggled over the years. For some of us, what that means is desperately trying to demonstrate our moral superiority to anyone who will listen. And for others, it means, well, something else. But no matter what, we all have our own particular weight of days. And when you think about it, the thing that makes all of that bearable, and sometimes even wonderful, is the fact that ultimately we're all each other's companions within the great kinship of humanity. All each other's teachers and students, if we can let ourselves be that. Just a thought. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching, and as always, take care of your soul.